I'm going to discuss 5 of the most important books that have helped shape my life to where I am today, helped me scale my business to over 300 employees and a 10,000 unit real estate portfolio. The first book was written in 1978. It's called The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. Now, I feel like for most entrepreneurs and most business owners, we all go down the road less traveled. But what struck me with this book is it was really centered around honesty and truth in doing business. It is basically a life of and a total dedication to total honesty. For some of you, that might not be a big deal. But I can tell you from firsthand experience, there's a lot of people that do not operate by those principles. So this book sold over 10 million copies back in the day, and it still continues to be a bestseller. So with continual examination each year, I evaluate where I am on a number of things. So I'm always taking a look at my life. I'm looking at my financials. I'm looking at my relationships with my kids and my friends, etc. I'm looking at my health. I'm looking at my spirituality. I'm also looking at my fun. So I have this wheel of things that I'm always looking at, and I'm evaluating myself on a scale of 1 to 10. So as an example, when my parents started to get older, and they started to retire and they started to do more things, I started to see them less as I was building my career. One of my goals was to see them 1 time a month, even though I live in Arizona and they live in Washington State. I have the same things going on right now as my kids are now aging and getting out of the house, where I have dinners with them at least 2 or 3 times a month. I'm using those metrics with all of my relationships. But I do the exact same thing with my personal finances, with my investments, with my spirituality, with my health, with my fun, with my travels. All of those things are measured. And this came right out of this book. The one thing in this book that you have to come to terms with is that you always need to be willing to be personally challenged on all of those things and not be defensive. So I find that a lot of people might be good at putting a scorecard together. They might not be good at the criticism from other people to be able to say, I think that score's too high. This happens all the time in marriages, for example. So one time I went to a big seminar where the man and the woman stood up and said, how would you rate your marriage on a scale of 1 to 10? And the man was always 2 or 3 points higher than the woman. And it was really interesting to me because the 2 perspectives, obviously the same relationship, could not have been more different. So being able to be personally challenged is a key part, because without that, you miss the third thing, which is the complete honesty. You have to be brutally honest with where you are, and until you are, you won't actually make any changes. The way that I actually have taken this book and applied it to my life is I do self-assessment in everything I do now. I'm continually asking other people for feedback so I can be brutally honest with where I sit today so that I can make better changes and corrections. And I think that's the one ingredient a lot of people don't do, is they might know where they stand, but they might be very afraid of changing because it's super uncomfortable. I find that this self-assessment and total honesty really resonates both in my personal life and in my business life, because when you're completely transparent and vulnerable even at work, then you start to see that reciprocation coming back from other people because they see that you are doing the same thing. The second book is Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, and it was written in 1937. Napoleon Hill interviewed over 500 millionaires at the time, including Andrew Carnegie. After all those interviews, he saw that there were 13 laws of success that emerged from those 500 interviews that he did from 500 millionaires. A couple takeaways from this book revolves around self-awareness. And there's a lot in this book about being self-aware. Having the desire and the faith, you definitely need those things to be able to pursue whatever it is you're going to do. But the biggest thing that I got from this book was the difference between specialized knowledge and general knowledge. Now, if you think about it, most schools actually direct you down a path of being very specialized. Like a doctor, like a CPA, like a dentist, those professions are very specialized. Napoleon Hill is saying is that the most successful people in the world actually have more generalized knowledge. Sometimes when your knowledge is so specialized and things change like markets or technology, and then all of a sudden you see that you maybe not be so relevant, you can always fall back to the generalized knowledge because you have more tools in your tool belt. So one of the biggest takeaways for me for that book is that you need to have very strong generalized knowledge, because especially in the world of business, and any entrepreneur knows, you have to know a little bit about a lot of things as opposed to a lot about one thing. How I was able to apply that for my business was to realize what I was really strong at and maybe what I wasn't so strong at. And I had to focus on the things that I wasn't so strong at. So in this business, I have to understand marketing. I have to understand finance. I have to understand IT. I have to understand the SEC and securities law. I have to understand property management. I have to understand utilities. I have to understand insurance. I have to understand all of the things underneath my umbrella so I can talk to anybody that specializes in those areas on a peer-to-peer basis. And because I have generalized knowledge, I could lose everything today and be transplanted anywhere and be able to resurrect myself very easily in any environment. Third book is Turning Pro. Now, this is a really small, easy book and a quick read, but the words are incredibly powerful. I don't think there's any fluff words in this book at all. In fact, some chapters are just a few sentences. The one quote I remember from Steven Pressfield is, "The amateur tweets, the pro works." And basically, what he does is he defines two paths. One path is an amateur path, and one path is a pro path. And there are very different habits on the pro path than there are on the amateur path. Even though both thinks that they're doing the right things, Steven Pressfield believes that going pro is a conscious decision. He believes that amateurs are running away from their calling and pros are actually going toward them. At our company, we bring together all our people one time a year. And so we had about 150 people in one room, and I bought everyone the book and had them read it a few months before. And then we had a facilitator actually talk about the things inside of this book. Essentially, our entire company did a book study on turning pro. And what emerged from here, because don't forget, I have leasing agents, I have maintenance people, we have marketing people, we have tech people, we have people doing all kinds of different roles. And each person really resonated with this book because everyone has pro habits and amateur habits. So one of the exercises we did during this book study was everybody had to write down who was a pro and who was an amateur. And that's a very powerful exercise because the list of amateurs was quite long and the list of pros were quite short. Then we would reflect on those and say, well, where do you sit in relation to those two lists? The other thing that the book does is it exposes things that are amateur habits. For example, like overeating, or maybe talking on your cell phone too much, or perhaps not exercising. Those are amateur habits. And not necessarily just personally. They can also be distractions and things that you're doing at work. So once you start to identify which habits you have that are amateur and which habits you have that are pro, and you're now self-aware, you can actually turn those amateur habits into pro habits, and you actually start on a different path. One of my biggest amateur habits was probably trying to multitask. So I now know, and I believe, that there's no such thing. You are actually present or you're not. It's impossible to be in two places at once. Even though many of you might argue with me, it's literally impossible for you to be in two places at once. If you think that's true, try having your cell phone while you're sitting there having a conversation with your kid. For me, one of the things I do for meetings is I turn off my phone or I leave it in my office so that I'm fully present and aware of what is being discussed in whatever meeting I've got. So some of the things I was a pro at were mostly built around relationships. I was always trying to build a culture in my office, but I was genuinely connected to the people in my office. I have lots of friends that are amateurs in this category where they just blow in and they work everybody really hard. But for me, I would say that was one of my strengths when I started. And that was one of the things I identified that I just needed to continue because, as you guys all know, the culture is the glue that keeps the company together. Number 4 is The Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. Now, I like all the books that Ryan Holiday writes. This book hit me at the right time because it was a book that basically highlights people that have egos. Of course, at the time, I'm like, well, that's not me. That's everybody else, which is exactly the whole point of the book. So people with egos most of the time look outside for fulfillment. They believe that a full life is in the outside world. But as we know, fulfillment actually lies within. And people with ego, it impedes learning and progress and talent. One of the biggest things I learned is that when people hit failure, and we all do, and they have big ego, it actually doesn't maximize the full recovery. It makes the recovery much more difficult. It's oftentimes very unconscious or in their subconscious. I found, especially when I was a young man, that material things were very important to me. Houses, cars, jets, those kinds of things. That's all ego. Or oftentimes you'll see it in relationships where one person just simply can't tell the truth because they're afraid, and that's all ego. All that stuff does is damage relationships. So at my own business, once I started to be self-aware and understand that there are times where I'm talking about things that are egoic, or even in situations where I might be wrong, the best thing to do is to not do that. And you start to get more authentic with people, and they are also getting authentic with you. Every person that gets some kind of level of success, they're bound to let it go, and they're ascending, and all of a sudden they think it's them. And the great thing about this book is it just kind of brings you right back down to where you need to be grounded, because nobody really cares about that. And when you bring it out, it's just your own insecurity, and it just wrecks everything else. It wrecks relationships, it wrecks momentum. All of those things are just damage to your progression. Probably if you don't think that you need this book, you're probably the one that actually needs it the most. And the fifth one is Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. This book saved me $250,000 in the first week that I read it. And this is a true story. So if you think about the book, it literally is never split the difference. And what does that mean? What it means is oftentimes, especially in real estate, when you find something, let's say it's $100,000, or in my case, we found some roof work that was needed on a property, and we got on the phone with the seller, and it was $500,000. And what did the seller say? And the broker? Why don't we just split the difference? It's God is my word this happened. And I started laughing because I had just read this book, and I did techniques from the book. And one of them is a 3-second pause. So the first thing I did was a 3-second pause and just listened. And then they started to talk again, which is exactly the whole point of a 3-second pause. This is just one of many techniques in the book. Basically what I said was, no, this is a seller problem, not a buyer problem. And we got it all the way down to zero. So at the beginning of the conversation, the offer was for me to accept $250,000 for the roofs of a $500,000 roof job, but I got it all the way to zero just from reading the book. I got so obsessed with this book, I actually read it multiple times. I got the audio book and I listened to it over and over and over because I also learned differently when I listened to audio. And I also bought the master class. And then I had Chris Voss on a Zoom, and I also invited him to our Limitless conference, which we do every year at limitlessexpo.com. And he was one of the main speakers at that conference, and I got an opportunity to do a podcast with him. During the podcast, he tried to trip me up on some of the techniques, but thankfully, I had read the book so much that it didn't work. So two of the techniques, one is called mirroring, and essentially letting somebody talk and then just repeating the last 3 words. I use this all the time. The other one is the 7, 38, and 55 rule. And that is that words represent 7% of communication, 38% of communication is tone, and 55% is somebody's body language. So these are just all some techniques from negotiation that I learned from the Chris Voss book. And I'm telling you, it's a must-read for business owners and, of course, for relationships. So a couple examples for body language would be if I'm sitting back like this, listening to somebody, that has a very different tone than I'm sitting there like this and I'm all in and listening to them and being very present. So this is not so present, closed down. And this one, of course, is extremely present. The other one is tone, of course. And this works essentially where you can lower your voice, or you can really, really raise it and make a point. So there's all kinds of things that you can do while you're communicating with people that actually can drive points home. One of the interesting things that's a commonality between all these books, and don't forget, these were written 100 years apart, all around self-awareness, presence, being self-reflective, but also having empathy and building relationships. Because what I found is you can take those same techniques and apply them with your friends, your family, your business, or anybody else. But I found a common theme through all of them, even though they were very different books. I'm sure that most of you have businesses or are trying to start one. I just made a video on 3 critical questions. Everyone that either has a business or is planning on starting one needs to be able to answer. I highly recommend watching that here.